Hello HEMA fans and welcome to this new video. So in this video I'm going to talk to you about this thing here, which you asked me about in many times in the comment section of some of my videos. This additional leather part added to some swords, especially after the 13th century, and after that to a substantial amount of swords, I would say, looking at the images we have, is called by many people Rainguard. By other people it's called Crossguard Chape, or with different names, like leather cross or whatever. So this leather protection for either the sword or the hand is not something clear, so we don't have a clear idea about it. So what was the purpose for adding this kind of leather part to the sword? So today I'm just going to give you some ideas and I just share with you some theories about what this thing was used for. So one of the most widespread ideas and theories about this tool is it being some kind of water protection. That's why of the name Rainguard. So some kind of protection from bad weather conditions. This theory is around, as far as I know, since the early 60s of the past century. It is not something which is based on actual data, actual sources that we have. It is just a theory which was, by the way, even embraced by Edward Oxford himself in one of his books in the 80s. But this thing is just a theory. That's important because sometimes when I call this kind of tool Crossguard Chape in some of my videos, people end up advocating that this tool is a Rainguard. So this is the most widespread name, but it is not probably its name. I mean, it is not the name for sure which was used to call it in the medieval times. Whatever the language was used, it was not a synonymous of this word, simply because we don't know if this was actually a rain protection. So there is a lot of people which is with this theory. There is a lot of people which just calls this tool a Rainguard because other people calls it a Rainguard or because it's wrote in some books or whatever. But there is also people which is advocating against this theory, mainly because this tool is generally made of leather. So it is not something, despite being treated in different way, the leather is not something that can stop a lot of water pretty easily. I will say that it is kind of hard. If you had used some kind of glove in your sword practice, you probably have noticed that leather gloves tend to get soaked after, I don't know, 20-30 minutes, depending from the weather, if it is summer or not. But if you sweat inside of your gloves, the gloves get soaked pretty easily. So the same thing is for the Rainguard. Despite being I don't know, thicker or not, the Rainguard is not a very good waterproof tool to protect the sword from rain. If this was the case, so if this Crossguard Chape was some kind of, let's say, humidity protection, probably was used together with other tools, like for example a cloak, because generally speaking also the swordsmen don't really like to get soaked in the rain. So the first protection for the sword is generally what the swordsman is wearing to protect himself. Then there is maybe this second layer of protection for the blade, and in this case we call it humidity protection, because it is not let's say protecting the sword from the rain itself. The cloak is doing it. Maybe it is some sort of thing to protect the sword from humidity, to get into it during, let's say, terrible weather conditions in which some kind of soldier or swordsman or noble, whatever, had to travel around under the rain for a lot of time. Maybe this is the case. So calling it Rainguard may be correct or not. So it may be the wrong word simply because it is not something that protects the sword from the rain itself. Maybe it was some kind of additional protection for the blade, and it was mainly protecting the sword from humidity in extremely bad weather conditions in the worst of the cases, let's say. Of course, to prove this theory being right or wrong, we simply need some kind of experimental archaeology made in this sense. So we need some kind of experiment made on the Crossguard Chape being some kind of Rainguard. So put some swords, a number of swords under the rain for some time and understand if some kind of crossguard shape made in one or the other way is useful to protect the blade from bad weather. Also, I have to point out that some chapes, some Rainguards are made of steel, and but this is the minority as far as we know. Of the older Rainguards. Generally speaking, looking also at the images, most probably the Rainguard was made most of the times of leather. So this would, generally speaking, go against the idea of it being some kind of water protection. Of course, if you have any kind of information, I mean, if you know any kind of experiment, actual experiment made on these Rainguards, just share it with me in the comment section and also with the other people which is following this channel, and I will be extremely interested to learn more about this tool being a Rainguard or not. That said, let's start to analyze all the different theories about what this leather tool is. So one of the theories which is around since some years by now is it being some kind of hand protection from, let's say, shallow cuts, which may happen when you are binding into an opponent's sword and maybe the swords are sliding into each other. And in this situation, this kind of protection may stop or partially stop the sword and protect your hand from this kind of cuts. Now, I am not really into this kind of theory. This thing resembles some kind of early made shield. There is something which is with this theory and something which is against it. I think it may protect your hand from some let's say tiny cuts or whatever. It can stop specific action on the blade, especially when the blades are almost on the same line, but it is still a piece of leather, so it may not be enough. It may be enough to deviate the cut. This may be interesting. Of course, there are different shapes in which this tool was made. The later one were basically a ring of leather. Maybe that one was more in line with stopping the cuts, so maybe the sword ended up chopping into it and get stuck into the protection. The early version was kind of two little flaps on the side. Maybe that one was more on the side of deviating the cut. I don't know, it is an interesting idea. I don't discard it at all. Maybe it was some kind of early version of the shield. But we have to consider that we can see blade swords with the shield and also with the Rainguard, so it is something weird. Considering what I just said, the ideal role, if it is some kind of protection, is not the same of the shield. So it should protect the hand on the other side. So if the shield is protecting your blade on the flat section of the sword, the Rainguard is protecting your hand in the edge section of the sword. So it may be some kind of hand protection, we don't know. So another theory which I ended up reading around in these years is it being some kind of hand protection from the blood sliding down over the blade during some kind of long battle or whatever. I don't know, this may be true simply because I don't have enough data. I mean, I never ended up being in some kind of battle. I don't know how much blood you can end up having on your hands when you are fighting since hours maybe or minutes or whatever, but it may be true or not, so I don't know. It's weird. It's probably the theory I don't take so much in consideration compared to the others, but actually this is actually a problem. I mean, I ended up in 2016 or 17, whatever, when I was still practicing a lot with minimal gear. During a winter I was practicing without my gloves, simply because I forgot them at home, and so I ended up being cut by a blur. You know, when you're practicing with minimal gear, you generally go really, really slowly. But I ended up being cut by a blur, by a very, very shallow cut on my hand, and being winter probably ended up making me not feel the cut. So I ended up with my main hand. I was using a two-handed sword full of blood, and I noticed that something was wrong simply because I ended up feeling my handle squishy in my hands. So it is actually true that having bloods on your hands, being your one or the one of someone else, on your hand is a problem when you are using your sword, because you start to feel your sword squishy and you can't grip the sword properly. So this may be true, but yeah, I don't know. It's weird. It reminds me about weird theories about like the fuller being for the blood or whatever. This thing, of course, this theory is more interesting because, as I said before, having blood on your hands when you're fighting, when you have to grip your sword, is an actual problem. So these may be true. It's less so important for me compared to the other theories, but still relevant. So the last theory, which is, as far as I know, my one, or if it is not my one, the one I advocate for, is it being some kind of protection from our own salvos. I mean, from our sweat, from our greasiness, whatever. So we are the worst thing for our sword, despite like bad weather condition. But I already said that probably it is not something against that thing specifically. Maybe it helps, but it is just a tiny help. Instead, if we consider this some kind of protection from our own sweat, together with our gloves, which can get soaked easily, especially during practice, but not only, it just needs to be summer and you just start to sweat. And so having something which protects the part of the blade which you manipulate the most, generally speaking, be it in war or just you are just touching the sword when you are in a parade or whatever, it is something which is useful because you already know that that's the part of the sword you end up touching the most. So in my opinion, it is some kind of protection for the sword itself. Every one of my practice swords have a part of the blade which is the most rusty, generally speaking. So it's the one that I have to clean the most, which is the shield. And or generally speaking, the part close to the crossguard, and also the crossguard itself. The only blade which don't have this problem is the one which has the Crossguard Chape. So I don't have to clean that part if I have the Crossguard Chape. So I consider it some kind of protection for the blade. I am still, of course, not sure about it. It may be simply because I am a swordsman, I practice a lot with swords, then I noticed that particular thing, it is useful for that motivation. And of course I am like the carpenter which tries to fix everything with a hammer and sees a hammer and a nail in any problem. But yeah, it may be this or not. I also consider that all these theories may just go together, and maybe it is some kind of a tool which is useful in many different ways. So maybe someone just started to use it as an aesthetic tool, and maybe it was just that. That's another theory. Maybe it was just something really cool to see. But maybe it was also useful. So we don't know if it is started as something fashionable or useful. We just know that it is, of course, really fashionable in a sense, but maybe it was useful in some senses. So it is important to say that the aesthetical part was most probably quite relevant, at least in my opinion, in my understanding. And it is also important to notice that this Crossguard Chape was present when another feature, which was, as far as we know, mainly aesthetical, was present into the scabbard. So early scabbard, but also scabbard in the same period of the so-called Crossguard Chape being kind of widespread, presented some kind of flaps over the level of the crossguard. So one theory which connects this thing to the Crossguard Chape is that it was some kind of tool to secure the sword into the scabbard. So these flaps maybe was there just to keep the sword in place and feel maybe also that the sword was in place while putting the sword into the scabbard. The Crossguard Chape maybe was also useful for this kind of motivation. We don't really know. So this we can consider this another theory, securing the sword into the scabbard. But it is also important to say that these two features were aesthetical. So one was present when the other one was not present, also because they are not easy to put together if you just notice. And maybe it was something purely aesthetical. We don't know. So Either it was one of the theories I just exposed you or just aesthetical motivation, this tool was present, the Crossguard Chape was present into a lot of swords since the end of the 13th century toward the basically end of the 15th century when the sword started to develop, generally speaking, a lot of complex hilts. So as I said, we don't know. I ended up talking about every theory that I know. I hope you will find this video interesting in some ways and you will find your own answers into it. So people, I hope you will find this video useful. Thanks for watching as always. Remember that if you want to help this channel grow up, you can just join my Patreon community, link in the description. Thanks for watching people, and as always, see you next time. Yeah. Okay.